Wonderful. Hi, everyone. Bienvenue. Welcome. Thank you, everyone, for coming to the 99th event of Disrupting Disruptions, the Feminist and Accessible Publishing, Communications, and Tech Speaker and Workshop Series. I'm Dr. Alex Ketchum, and I'm a professor of feminist and social justice studies at McGill and the organizer of this series. The Feminist and Accessible Publishing, Communications, and Tech Speaker and Workshop Series seeks to bring together scholars, creators, and people in industry working at the intersections of digital humanities, computer science, feminist studies, disability studies, communication studies, LGBTQ studies, history, and critical race theory. I'm so excited to welcome you all, and welcome to the start of our 7th season. Some notes on accessibility. As is the case with all of our hybrid and virtual events, we have cart captioning in English, tonight provided by our captioner, Sarah. You can turn your captions on at the bottom of your screen. Tonight, we have a Q&A option available. So throughout the event, you may type your questions into the question and answer box, and there will be some time during the second part of the event for Dr. Flowers to answer them. We can't guarantee that every question will be answered, but we are grateful for the discussion that you generate. We have 4 other upcoming events this semester. All are hybrid or virtual. You can find our full schedule as well as video recordings of our past events at disruptingdisruptions.com. So that's the redirect URL, disruptingdisruptions.com. The other URL is way too long to remember. You can also find our list of sponsors, including Shirk, Milieu, Recaf, and more. As we welcome you into our homes and our offices through Zoom, and you welcome us into yours, let us be mindful of space and place. As many of you know, past series speakers, Suzanne Kite, Jess McLean, Mel Hogan, and Sasha Lucioni, have pointed to the physical and material impacts of the digital world. While many of the events this semester are virtual or hybrid, everything that we do is tied to the land and the space that we are on. We must always be mindful of the lands that the servers enabling our virtual events are on. Indigenous communities are disproportionately impacted by mining practices used for materials that are used to build our computers and digital infrastructure. Furthermore, as the series seeks to draw attention to power relations that have been invisibilized, it is important to acknowledge Canada's long colonial history and current political practices. This series is affiliated with the Institute for Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies of McGill University. McGill is located in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, on unceded Kanien'kehá:ka territory. Furthermore, the ongoing organizing efforts by Indigenous communities, water protectors, and people involved in the land back movements make clear the ever-present and ongoing colonial violence in Canada. Interwoven with this history of colonization is one of enslavement and racism. This university's namesake, James McGill, enslaved Black and Indigenous peoples. It was in part from the money he acquired through these violent acts that McGill University was founded. We see that activism on campus today addressing the ongoing ways that the university is intertwined with colonial violence, with ongoing colonial violence. These histories are here with us in this space and inform the conversations we have today. I encourage you to learn more about the lands that you are on. Nativelands.ca is a fantastic resource for beginning. Now for today's event. Sorry, I just read my note saying bio. Sorry. Now for today's event. Dr. Johnathan Flowers is an assistant professor of philosophy at California State University, Northridge. Flowers' research areas include African American intellectual history, Japanese aesthetics, American pragmatism, philosophy of disability, and philosophy of technology. His first monograph, Mono No Aware and Gender as Affect in Japanese Aesthetics and American Pragmatism, was published by Lexington Books in 2023. I'm so excited for today's event. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Flowers. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for having me, and I will get my slide deck up in one moment. Oh, there we are. Okay, so thank you very much for having me. It's my pleasure to be here. So what I am going to present today is a development of some previous work that I have done in the Bloomsbury Guide to Philosophy of Disability and in other spaces. And I look forward to all of your questions and comments on it. So to begin, on August 30th, NaNoWriMo, the 25-year-old nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting aspiring authors, released a statement on its Zendesk website explaining its position on AI. wherein the organization states that the categorical condemnation of artificial intelligence has classist and ableist undertones, further stating that the organization recognizes and respects writers who believe that AI tools are right for them. So were this position not problematic enough, the statement clarified that the organization's understanding of the ableist nature of the categorical condemnation of AI in the following text, right? So not all brains have the same abilities, and not all writers function at the same level of education and proficiency in the language in which they are writing. Some brains and ability levels require outside help or accommodations to achieve certain goals. And so this statement had several consequences. One, the organization faced widespread backlash for tying the use of AI, specifically generative AI, to issues of accessibility in class. The organization's writers board was hit with a number of resignations, including authors Cass Morris and Daniel Jose Older. And three, I had to rewrite the entire first half of this talk. And so to this end, while this talk will still explain how the increasing integration of algorithmic technologies into our daily lives not only relies on structures of ableism in society, but imposes new ableist social and political structures through their everyday applications, it will do so by means of describing algorithmic technologies as political technologies in the sense intended by Langdon Winner. Insofar as these political technologies rely on ableism as a political order, this talk will also challenge us to reframe how we understand the use of algorithmic technologies as accessibility technologies, contra to NaNoWriMo's now revised statement and the myriads of pieces that make such declarations over against the experiences of disabled people who use such technologies. So now to begin to think through the ways that algorithmic technologies could even begin to function in the mode of accessibility aids, we would need an account of how such technologies enable disabled persons to resolve how an individual does not fit their environment through their disability. Here I will draw on Rosemary Garland Thompson's concept of the misfit, wherein misfitting is the failure of an environment to extend a body in action. On this view, the degree to which an algorithmic platform can serve as an assistive technology will be relative to the degree that it resolves a particular misfit between the disabled person and the world around them. So I argue that very few algorithmic platforms are intended for such uses, and it is the ways that AI hype has captured discourse about algorithmic platforms that obscures the very real narratives about how disabled persons use algorithmic technologies. And finally, were this not ambitious enough, this talk will conclude by putting forward a tentative proposal for reimagining disability in digital spaces. So to this end, while Garland Thompson is specifically concerned about the social world and the built world as producing misfits, argues that we need to consider how disability produces misfits through the ways in which the digital world fails to extend disabled bodies in their actions. That is, we need an account of disability as mediated through digital technologies, including interconnected communications technologies like social media platforms, blogging sites, online fora, and even Zoom meetings like the one that we're having right now. To this end, this would consider how disability is digitized in ways beyond questions of universal design and to ask what it is to be embodied as a disabled person in digital space. So again, to do so, I will draw on my own lived experience as a terminally online disabled person with ADHD to articulate some features of how such theorizing might proceed. And so now, before I begin, I want to offer something of a preparatory note borrowed from my previous work, Algorithms as Ableist Orientation Devices, in the Bloomsbury Guide to Philosophy of Disability. So following Emily Tucker, I will try not to use the terms artificial intelligence and machine learning or their synonyms, except in relation to direct quotations. Rather, I will refer to these technologies as algorithms or algorithmic platforms. Insofar as the term artificial intelligence conceals how algorithmic technologies maintain an organization of the world around ableism and colonialism, as well as hiding the ways such power dynamics structure this world, the term artificial intelligence implicitly enables the ableist, eugenicist, and racist purposes to which these technologies are routinely put to be perceived as unmitigated goods and advancements in society. And so by refusing to use the terms artificial intelligence and machine learning, I aim to point to the histories of colonialism and ableism that are implicit in the deployment and design of such algorithmic platforms. So as Kathy O'Neill and Langdon Winter have separately noted, we must attend to the political and social purposes that motivate the introduction of these technologies rather than simply try to understand the technologies themselves. In other words, we must try to discern what it is that the persons who design and deploy these technologies seek to accomplish, as well as what the technologies themselves seek to accomplish through their deployment. And it is this attention to the political and social purposes of algorithms that motivates my choice to once again use Winter's "Do artifacts have politics?" As I stated above, in my previous work, I drew upon Winter's work to demonstrate the ways that technologies orient individuals in line with the histories that precede the technologies. So for Winter, the disability justice movement made clear the political structure that drove the organization of the built environment by demonstrating the ways in which the built environment denied disabled persons full participation in society. So in this piece, I frame Winter's observations that architects and city planners have not engaged in intentional neglect as a product of the naturalization of a history of assumptions about who should be able to access public spaces and who should not, about who will use public spaces and who will not, that leads to the technological institution of inaccessible spaces. So to this end, the assertion that this institutional inaccessibility is the product of longstanding neglect rather than the product of the naturalization of ableist assumptions in design indicates how technology itself inherits ableist assumptions which subsequent orient people towards or away from participating in society in particular ways. And so the logical extension of Winter's statements in "Do Artifacts Have Politics?" is the recognition that inaccessible design, whatever shape it might take, is a product of the politics of ableism. In the above, the inaccessibility of the built environment is made manifest as the political meaning of the built environment in the form of ableism as demonstrated through public protest. In short, for Winter, even if the inaccessibility of structures was the product of longstanding neglect, which I would argue is itself a political choice to relegate disabled people to the shadows, the persistence of inaccessibility within the built environment was a product of the ways that as Winter states, a given device might have been designed and built in such a way that it produces a set of consequences logically and temporally prior to any of its intended or any of its professed uses. So ableism, in the form of continued neglect of the possibility that a disabled person might desire or need access to the built environment in ways that enable their full participation in the social activities that take place within those environments, is predicated on an ableist worldview that assigns disabled persons to a subordinate status. It is the politics that is inherent to much of our built, and as I will demonstrate, digital environment. So to this end, Winter has a very specific way of cashing out what it means for an artifact to have an inherent politics. And insofar as this is the case, Winter supplies two ways of understanding this concept. I will focus only on one. To this end, as Winter states, one version claims that the adoption of a given technical system actually requires the creation and maintenance of a particular set of social conditions as the operating environment of that system. The thing could not exist as an effective operating entity unless social as well as material conditions were met. The meaning of required here is that of a practical rather than logical, or is that of practical rather than logical. And so on this view, a given technology requires a specific set of social and material conditions to be what it is. Winter's use of material conditions is borrowed from Marx and Engels, and not only refers to the raw physical materials that make possible some kind of commodity, but the histories of social and cultural exchange that enable the commodity to have a particular value. Following Sarah Ahmed, you might say that a particular piece of technology inherits the history that enabled it to come into being, a history that is made manifest in the present through the specific shape that the technology takes, its intended use cases, and the context of its development. So further, Winter's inclusion of social conditions should not be taken to indicate a strict dichotomy between the social and the material, as they are continuous, but should be taken to indicate a difference in emphasis. Even if the material conditions necessary to give rise to a specific piece of technology are available, the social conditions must also be necessary to give rise to that technology. In his paper, Winter uses the example of the nuclear bomb to demonstrate this point. I, however, prefer an example closer to my heart, Star Trek. So to paraphrase Mr. Spock in Star Trek Strange New Worlds, while it is possible for a culture to develop a warp bomb, which relies on the annihilation of matter and antimatter to create an explosive reaction, prior to the development of the warp drive, which uses the same reaction to propel a ship faster than light, such a thing has not happened in the history of Star Trek due to the ways in which a culture would need to develop to create the possibility for such technology. Put simply, the social conditions must operate in transaction with the material conditions to enable the development of a specific technology in a specific way. So let's look at a specific example close to the algorithmic technologies that NaNoWriMo had in mind in its statement, right? Disability detection algorithms. So briefly, these are technologies that rely on predictive algorithms trained on massive amounts of medical data about the presentation of disability across age spectrums to generate an accurate prediction of the possibility of the development of a disabling condition. So putting aside the fact that, as Ashley Shue, Rosemary Garland Thompson, and Susan Wendell have all noted, we will all become disabled in some way over the course of our lives. These programs aim to classify persons as potentially disabled in advance of any encounter with the world. More specifically, they classify individuals according to their risk of developing a disability and, inevitably, the risk of developing an undesirable life. Indeed, as Cynthia Bennett and Oz Keys note, AI systems in this domain are built on the premise that an early diagnosis is a good outcome, that diagnosis leads to possibilities of treatment, support, and consideration. Notwithstanding the already discussed biases in who can access diagnosis and how diagnostic tests are constructed, there are serious questions about whether an earlier diagnosis is a better one. Rather than helping people, earlier diagnoses may harm them. So as I have argued elsewhere, these technologies serve to situate a disabled person in line with what Joseph Sramondo calls an ideology of pity, while simultaneously presupposing a naturalized misfit, that is, a natural inability of the disabled person to fit into the world due to their disability, thereby retaining the organization of the world around ability and obscuring the power relations and politics of technology that indeed make possible this world through these technologies. More germane to the conversation at hand is the way that Stramondo's ideology of pity, which presumes that a disabled life is an unfortunate or less fulfilling life, and Garland Thompson's misfit can be construed as political structures which are required to provide the conditions whereby algorithmic early detection becomes an unmitigated good through how it rescues people from a disabled life. In short, it requires a social arrangement that presumes the inherent negativity of disability to make possible an algorithmic platform that can help avoid such an unfortunate fate. Now, this gets us to the algorithmic technologies that NaNoWriMo had in mind in its statement reproduced here once again. So if we follow Ahmed, we might say that this statement phenomenologically orients anyone who condemns the use of generative algorithms in writing as against the inclusion of disabled persons in the space of writing. Indeed, similar arguments have been made regarding image generation algorithms as democratizing the creation of art by removing, among other things, barriers to entry into artistic creation that emerge at the intersection of disability and the technical skill required to create art. On this view, to be against generative algorithms in creative space is to be against the participation of disabled persons within creative activities. Now, this is, of course, bullshit, but it does indicate the ableist politics inherent to and which underlie the promotion of algorithmic platforms as solutions to the problem of the inclusion of disabled persons in two ways. First, it demonstrates the reliance of algorithmic platforms on what Bonnie Tucker calls techno-capitalist disability rhetoric, which restricts the agency of disabled persons by placing the focus on the product, which seeks to resolve disability as a problem. Second, it demonstrates the reliance of algorithmic solutions to disability on what Ashley Shue calls techno-ableism, where the belief that the technological elimination of disability should be the proper goal of technological development. Techno-ableism also includes the use of technology to reassert or put in place ableist ideologies by means of a techno-social order. So common to both techno-capitalist disability rhetoric and techno-ableism is the restriction of the agency of disabled persons in favor of a focus on the technological solution and on the view developed from Winner above, the articulation of an inherent politics of ableism. So I want to be clear. We know that algorithmic platforms inherit ableism. We know that their applications extend ableist belief structures. We have almost a decade's worth of research which has indicated the ways that algorithmic platforms through their training data extend ideologies of ableism. So for example, in 2017, Callixon argued that if we build an intelligent system that learns enough about the properties of language to be able to understand and produce it, in the process, it will also acquire historic cultural associations, some of which can be objectionable. And then, not 3 years after Callixon's prediction, Ben Hutchinson and his colleagues found that for queries derived from most of the phrases referencing persons who do have disabilities, a larger percentage of predicted words produced negative sentiment scores. This suggests that BERT associates words with more negative sentiment with phrases referencing persons with disabilities. Now, among these words associated with persons with disabilities were homelessness, addiction, violence, and unemployment. And while the work qualifying this impact on hiring is still in its early stages, it is not unreasonable to assume that the patterns that we have seen in algorithmic bias, where people of color, women, and LGBTQ folks are concerned, will also be duplicated where disabled persons are concerned. Thus, to paraphrase Frederick Douglass, I have better employments for my strength than to argue a point that has been demonstrated by study after study. What is less clear, however, is how techno-ableism and techno-capitalist disability rhetoric as political structures shape and organizes algorithmic technologies such that statements like the one made by NaNoWriMo and other AI evangelists are possible. So the first and most primary way this happens, I believe, is through the capture of algorithmic platforms by corporate interests. For example, predictive algorithmic applications have been used in the development of hearing aids for at least 2 decades. And while many of these applications are aimed at training the hearing aid to amplify and select from among disparate sounds in high noise environments, or have been used to enhance audio quality through the device, few of these applications have been consciously labeled as AI-driven or AI-powered until recently. Now, this rebranding demonstrates the ways that techno-capitalist disability rhetoric extends techno-ableism into the space of assistive technology, a pattern which follows the historical capture of algorithmic applications as described by Meredith Whittaker, right? And she states, companies acquire labs and startups and work to pitch AI as a multi-tool of efficiency and precision, suitable for nearly every purpose across countless domains. When we say AI is everywhere, this is why. And so in the context of assistive technologies, presenting AI as a multi-tool of efficiency and precision results in the alignment of assistive technologies with the politics of ableism through how existing technological practices were captured by the broader impetus to rebrand these practices under the label of AI. This capture thereby shifted the focus from the ways in which the device enabled a disabled person to better navigate the world to the ways that the device represented an innovation, an advance in the technologies that promises a transformation of the disabled person from someone dependent upon support into an approximation of the able-bodied subject by means of better technological innovation. So for example, both Starkey and Phonak, hearing aid companies which use algorithmic classification systems in their models of hearing aids, have recently pivoted to describing these hearing aids as AI-powered or AI-driven when no such technology is in operation within the device. Phonak in particular makes no secret of its pivot towards relabeling its technologies as AI, claiming over 24 years experience in AI and machine learning, though this claim is buttressed with an asterisk indicating distinctions between AI, machine learning, and deep learning. Despite this, Phonak describes its latest hearing aid technology as relying on a paradigm shift brought about by algorithmic applications. And they state, it is the world's first hearing aid with a dedicated artificial intelligence chip, Deep Sonic, which introduces a paradigm shift in hearing technology. The proprietary chip hosts a deep neural network algorithm that significantly suppresses the background noise from any direction, leading to remarkable speech intelligibility improvements for individuals using hearing aids. And I feel terrible having read that out loud. So in the foregoing, we should note that there is a constant slide between artificial intelligence, deep neural network, and algorithm, which obfuscates the functions of the technology in use. Pessimistically, I might describe this as a kind of AI hype word salad intended to impress a potential user without supplying much in the way of a description of how the technology is intended to function. More charitably, and following Tucker, I would describe the above device as a piece of hardware advertised as having the ability to suppress background noise based on algorithmic processes which are intentionally kept obscure for the sake of presenting the device as an advance over other assistive technologies. However, this is not to say that Phonak's claims cannot be verified or that it is engaged in deceptive advertising. Rather, it is to say that the advertisement positions the advances in technology as the primary focus of the description rather than the material benefits it may bring to disabled persons. And so the foregoing is but one commercial example of how pre-existing technologies, specifically pre-existing assistive technologies that draw upon algorithmic technologies, are captured by the techno-ableist and techno-capitalist disability rhetoric that undergirds the politics of algorithmic technologies. And so for the sake of time, I will not elaborate on the ways that both Phonak and Starkey hearing aids integrate Sue's valence technologies into their devices, which enable remote health monitoring and app connectivity far beyond the potential needs of disabled persons. To this end, the rebranding of algorithmic classification technologies in use in hearing aids as AI indicates the ways in which techno-capitalism shapes the kinds of technologies made available to disabled persons. Moreover, this reframing relies on a milder form of techno-ableism that positions algorithmic technologies as the future solution to problems of disability. Now, a more pernicious way, our example is found in the ways that mass media reporting enables the capture of disability narratives that center or in ways that center the technology rather than the disabled person. So, for example, a July 2012 article in Nature featured several stories of disabled scientists who use generative algorithms as accessibility devices. One example close to my experience is that of Tigsit Tamir, a postdoctoral researcher who uses generative algorithms as accessibility aids to assist with his ADHD. Now, in the example of Tamir, what is elided in his narrative is that Tamir is deploying the algorithmic platforms in ways that enable him to overcome a misfit between himself and his environment. So, for example, when Tamir says, whether I'm reading, writing, or just making to-do lists, it's very difficult for me to figure out what I want to say. One thing that helps is to just do a brain dump and use AI to create a boiled down version, right? This enables him to overcome, say, a misfit between his executive function and the requirements of operating in a world that requires regimented schedules, regular clock time, and in general does not operate according to crypt time. So in the second example, not only do generative algorithms resolve a misfit between Kang and her environment, they also enable her to resolve a misfit between herself and her social environment. Further, that these examples take place within the academy is important. As Jay Dolmage and Shelley Tremaine have observed, academia itself is a hostile environment for disabled scholars and one that often involves cripping the structure of the academy for survival. So in this context, I am relying on Rosemary Garland Thompson's concept of the misfit, which she describes as the consequence of an environment that fails to enable the shape and function of bodies that enter it. To this end, misfitting is a failure of, Misfitting is a failure of an environment to enable the extension of the body in its action. Here, environment includes, as Garland Thompson notes, received and built things ranging from accessibly designed public spaces, welcoming natural surroundings, communication devices, tools, and implements, as well as other people. To this end, in both of the narratives presented on the slide, we can see the ways in which disabled academics repurposed technology such that it can resolve misfits between the social environment and the physical environment in which these scholars are embodied. So to this end, generative algorithms promise the overcoming of a misfit between a person with disabilities and an environment structured to be inhospitable to the extension of their bodies. In the case of ADHD, this is an environment structured around focus, attention, clock time, and rigid structure. And to the extent that generative algorithms promise this overcoming of this misfit, they do so through supplying a tool that allows for the organization of thoughts to enable or to compensate for those structures that are impaired. So again, Tamir's use of generative algorithms is not itself participating in techno-ableism or techno-capitalist disability rhetoric as much as my use of products like Calendly or Microsoft PowerPoint's design feature to organize this wonderful slide deck supplement my own inability to decide on organization. Now, indeed, many of the CRIP uses of generative algorithms as presented in the Nature article, like transcribing and summarizing lectures, transcribing text to images to resolve aphasia, and translation are legitimate uses of algorithmic technologies for the sake of resolving a misfit between the individual and the world. However, there is a concern that the way in which they are framed within the article as examples of why we might take caution in regulating the use of generative algorithms speaks to a potential to capture the space and the possibility of cripping the use of generative algorithms for the sake of what is generally called AI hype. And this possibility enables an oblique form of techno-ableism and techno-capitalist disability rhetoric, which is realized in this excerpt from a CNN article from April of this year, which states, new generative AI tools are especially promising for accessibility applications because they're designed to understand and produce information in various formats, including text, audio, photos, and videos. This means that if a person needs to consume information in a certain media, AI can act as a go-between, for instance, turning a piece of audio into written text for a hearing-impaired user. As Gebru and colleagues point out, algorithmic platforms are not engaged in any mode of understanding. They are engaged in a parroting of content within their database. As a consequence, the CNN article uncritically presents algorithmic technologies as being able to understand text for the disabled person rather than as an aid for the disabled person's own understanding. In contrast, the examples in the Nature article demonstrate the ways in which the disabled person uses these technologies to resolve misfits between themselves and the environment. In the Nature article, the disabled person is the subject of the text and its framing, rather than being the objects of assistance or beneficence of the technologies as presented in the CNN article. And so here then, we might return to the problem of the NaNoWriMo statement and the problem of claims made on behalf of algorithmic platforms which promise to democratize creative or other activities, right? Specifically, the problem of positioning the criticism of generative AI in these spaces as being against disability or access to creative spaces. While I am willing to give the authors of the and editorial staff of Nature the benefit of the doubt for their story, I view the deployment of narratives of cripping generative algorithms or putting them to use in ways that resolve the misfit between a disabled body and the world of the academy as cautionary tales against regulative overreach to be problematic and proceeding from some of the same misplaced concern. Put another way, my worry is that by presenting the unique ways that disabled persons use generative algorithms to resolve their individual misfits between themselves and their environment, we may unintentionally provide support for the ableist politics that undergird the promotion of generative algorithms as solutions to disability within some contexts. Moreover, we not only ignore the ways that many of these technologies under discussion are designed for disabled persons, but the ways that disabled persons exercise agency in how they deploy the technology rather than what technology they're deploying. And so briefly, by way of conclusion, I would like to propose that the question of how a digital technology is deployed versus what technology is deployed is also pertinent to how disability itself is articulated within digital spaces. Indeed, there has been much research on the how of disability community formation in online spaces, but comparatively less conversation about the formation and articulation of disability identity in online spaces. Specifically, the discursive practices that make present disability in large and small ways. As an example of discursive practices, a 2019 study deployed an algorithmically aided assessment of social media language, or an algorithmically aided assessment of social media language had a 78% accuracy in predicting ADHD from social media posts. While the authors of the study state that this was not adequate for a screening detection of the US population, and I would argue nor should it be, for my purposes, it indicates the possibility of a unique set of discursive habits that emerge from the interaction between the materiality of the digital environment and the materiality of the disabled person. Indeed, the study noted the posting behavior of adults with self-described ADHD is consistent with the features of the disorder. That ADHD adults posted more frequently on a platform that provides immediate and quick feedback makes sense. Such a platform should be desirable to individuals who, as a group, have difficulties delaying gratification. Now, while I do take issue with the description of individuals with ADHD as individuals who, as a group, have difficulties delaying gratification, my lived experience of the use of microblogging sites like Twitter and Blue Sky, in contrast to my inability to sustain the attention to, say, maintain a weekly blog or a Substack letter, lends some credence to the idea that the materiality of one's disability affects one's choice in platform and the discursive presentation of one's disability through how one uses social media platforms, not just the purposes for which one uses social media platforms. And insofar as this is the case, I would argue that we need to pay more attention to the unique ways in which disabled persons' embodiment, it results in unique forms of discursive representations of identity in digital spaces, such that we can have a more thoroughgoing understanding of the way in which disabled solidarity and political activity takes place in spaces or in digital environments. As hashtags like Crypt the Vote have indicated, disabled persons in online spaces are both politically active and motivated to come together in solidarity in support for social change across lines of race, gender, sexual orientation, and even disability status. And so, to be clear, what has followed is a brief sketch of broader research that I would like to do to better articulate the ways in which algorithmic technologies, particularly when deployed in the context of disability, are reliant upon both techno-ableism and techno-capitalist disability rhetoric to present the algorithmic technologies themselves as unmitigated goods in opposition to their uses within the spaces in which they are deployed, as opposition to attempts to ensure access to those spaces for or on behalf of disabled persons. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to turn my camera on in one moment. But yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. And oh, there's my camera thing. Sorry. Thank you for that presentation. I want to welcome everyone to write your questions into the question and answer box below so Dr. Flowers can answer them. We will only read your first name if you're worried about privacy, or you can have it as no name listed. While we're waiting questions from the audience after that wonderful presentation, I will start us off. So I want to first give you a little bit of time to speak to something that you mentioned when you're discussing the hearing aids. One of the points that you talked about was how these technologies can also create some forms of surveillance or surveillance and remote health monitoring beyond potential needs. And I was wondering if you can speak a bit more about that. As you mentioned, it was something that you'd like to give more space to later. And also just about the ways that how intertwined some of these techno-capitalist and techno-ableist rhetorics are with surveillance.
Oh, absolutely. So, Ashley Shue has a wonderful article called, oh, there it is. A wonderful article called Ableism, Techno-Ableism, and Future AI, wherein she points to the ways in which many algorithmic technologies intended to aid caretakers, both for the elderly and for disabled persons, rely on a ostensibly a digital version of what Mia Mingus calls forced intimacy, right? The disabled person or the elderly person is forced to supply vast amounts of personal data about their physicality, their disability, their daily life, their habits, to these technologies such that they can be more effectively monitored by what amounts to a digital panopticon. And that I would not say is surveillance, but pure surveillance 100%. Now, the surveillance elements come in things like hearing aids that also engage in, say, tracking your fitness and health goals, right? So for example, there are some hearing aids that provide similar functionality to a smartwatch or a Fitbit insofar as they track things like your health progress towards certain goals, e.g. analogously to like closing rings on an Apple Watch, your heart rate, the number of steps you take each day, and even social interactions. And that last one is the one that I find most problematic as integrated into an accessibility device, right? I can understand if the algorithmic application within the device needed such data to better adjust the audio gains in different environments, but I do not understand the integration of that technology into a hearing aid that is paired with an app and offers this as a feature. And this is what I mean by surveillance technology. Insofar as a number of these new AI-enabled hearing aids also include biometric technologies that are paired with proprietary apps, which introduces a whole collection of privacy concerns. I struggle with, to put it simply, nobody asked for this. And it seems like an unnecessary incorporation into a piece of technology that ostensibly has a singular focus. I mean, for example, even some of the Starkey hearing aids have accelerometers and gyroscopes, which allow them to detect if the wearer has fallen. And I can imagine this being like problematic for somebody who is using one of these hearing aids, who is engaged in, like, say, particular kinds of physical activities, right? There's also the problem that many of these hearing aids are, upwards of $5,000. So that is the surveillance part. It bothers me a great deal.
Thank you so much for elaborating on that. Again, I want to encourage attendees to write your questions. I know sometimes it takes a little while to type them out too, as we're dealing with such subject matter. Sarah, I wanted to give space if Sarah, you had a question. I have more, but while we're waiting, you wanted to.
Thank you. Such an interesting presentation. I have kind of two questions. You can
Mhm,
pick which one you like more and answer that. So the first is, as we've kind of moved and been forced to move so many spaces online,
mhm.
I just wanted to know if you have any recommendations for, us as instructors, as people who have to sometimes have friendships entirely online, for how to make those engagements less ableist for students, for ourselves, for yeah, friends as well. And then the second question is just a little bit more, if you have any more information about like how these apps are formulated. It seems like there's, like you said, no one has really asked for a lot of these technologies. So I'm just sort of curious about the research side and the development, and if there are advisory boards or a push for more inclusion from disability
Mhm.
justice movement folks, or if this is kind of being developed in just like a very corporate setting. So yeah, like I said, you can choose which one you like more. Thank you.
So I think I'll do both of them. Where the development of these sort of surveillance hearing aids is concerned, I actually don't know. As part of my preparation for this talk, I went through the documentation on the FOTAC website to try and find out the answer to some of these questions. And much of it is a description of the technologies that they're using, the ways in which their like new chipsets are in advance over the previous technologies, which they I will give them credit. They do have some demonstrations that demonstrate the difference in audio quality that is provided through like machine or through algorithmic applications. But I honestly wasn't able to, and I'm struggling with whether that is a limitation of myself as a researcher. Maybe I'm not looking in the right place, or given the way that Fotech on its website says this is a proprietary technology, right? I don't think they have any real impetus to make transparent or explainable the technology they're using here, which is problematic for a variety of reasons. As for who's responsible for the incorporation of surveillance technology into hearing aids, I don't know. I would imagine it is the same. It is a product of the same sort of cultural trends that have incorporated surveillance into our cars and refrigerators and our toilets, where places where they have no business being. So I would say, in general, one of the things that I would like to do in a more expanded version of this presentation is point to the ways that the increasing incorporation of surveillance and surveillance technologies into technologies that are ostensibly intended as accessibility aids actually reinforces the confinement of disabled persons and the stripping away of the agency of disabled persons. That is to say, I would never buy a pair of glasses, for example, that constantly tracked my eye movements with an idea towards improving my visual acuity. Absolutely not. Um, as for how to make Zoom meetings more accessible, so this is an ongoing sort of struggle I have, because one of the sort of maximal sort of modes of accessibility is the provision of captioning. And not for nothing, this is a a sort of techno-ableist brass ring to provide 100% accurate captioning technology, such that you don't have to rely on cart services or humans trained to do this, which in my view is a mistake. And I'll give you an example of this, right? One of the things that I have recently been doing in my in-person teaching is using Microsoft PowerPoint's captioning functionality, which works surprisingly well, assuming I'm teaching something that is solely within the milieu of Western philosophy. The moment I start teaching East Asian philosophy, the captioning functionality breaks down, likely because the database it was trained on is a database of English language concepts, right? And insofar as that's the case, it is largely only functional within a sort of narrow guideline. So I would say broader access to like in a dream world, any Zoom meeting, any classroom that was held or a class that was held in a hybrid or online fashion would have a dedicated like cart sort of thing. And one of the things that I've noticed is better student comprehension when my computer is captioning my lecture as I'm giving it, right? So students don't have to typically don't have to ask me to repeat as many things. They're more engaged in note taking, likely because they have subtitles for Dr. Flowers as he is delivering a lecture. And so this is one of the ways, but other than that, I would say flexible policies about the use of cameras, not using any of the Proctorio or other edu surveillance technologies as part of your pedagogical methodologies, incorporating use of chat and other text-based communications in your say Zoom-based class, so that students don't necessarily have to like unmute and raise their hands or turn on their cameras, things like that. Perhaps assigning a student to monitor the chat so that you do not miss questions, things like that.
Thank you.
So we have two audience questions. I'll read the first one, and then after this question and we respond to it, Sarah will read the next one. So an anonymous attendee writes, I see highlighting AI in assistive tech as a way to possibly reduce stigma, since stigma is a barrier for adoption. What are your thoughts about this? What do we need to be careful about when thinking and discussing about AI applications for AT? Technologies.
Yeah, so this is actually a really good question, right? So the thing that we need to be thinking about is, with regards to generative algorithms or predictive algorithms or other kinds of algorithmic technologies and assistive technology is what role are they playing in the technology? Like what, to put it another way, what misfit between the disabled person and the world does the integration of algorithmic technologies help resolve? So for example, predictive algorithms and in the mode of audio technologies can generate much better audio quality in over a wide variety of applications, right? This could have demonstrable benefits for folks using hearing aids, other kinds of technologies like text to speech, which is sort of fundamental to screen readers and is kind of core to things like OCR and other kinds of assistive technologies, provide a function there. There is a functional need for the application of these algorithmic technologies, which vastly improves their capacity to act as assistive technologies. And so the question is, what material difference will it make in the lived experience of the disabled user, right? Even like OCR for me is wonderful because there are times when my ADHD is just like, I cannot with this sitting here and reading pages of philosophy. I refuse. And so having technology that can read the article for me is incredibly useful. And it's become more so as I've gotten older. And so put simply, what we need to be careful about when thinking and discussing algorithmic applications for assistive technology is the functional role it plays in the lived experience of the disabled user. If you cannot provide a use case for this given integration, then there is probably not a good reason to integrate it, right?
Thank you. Sarah, do you want to?
Thanks so much. So an anonymous attendee asks, how do you feel about algorithmically generated captions for images?
I have mixed feelings about them, right? Image recognition is an interesting field that has a pile of biases baked into it. Every facial, almost, yeah, actually, I can't say this. Every facial recognition application used in law enforcement comes with it a disclaimer that says this is not for use in adjudicating, innocence or guilt, or and should not be the sole determinant in arresting a given suspect. And yet, said technologies are used constantly for this. Now, this might seem far afield from the question of what do I think about image recognitions, but it really isn't. Many of the reasons why image recognition in law enforcement, facial recognition in law enforcement is problematic is not simply due to the data sets, but due to the inability of the technology to recognize non-white persons, right? And this is a problem that goes all the way back to the development of optical technology. Rua Benjamin has a very good chapter on this in algorithms, not in Algorithms of Oppression, because that's Sophia Noble's book, in Race After Technology, where she talks about, where she presents the continuity of discrimination by facial recognition algorithm with the history of optics as being tuned to better capture white people. And so all of this is to say, AI generated alt text is a wonderful dream if you can get the technology to that point. And indeed, the only place where I would reliably trust algorithmically generated alt text is in NASA image type things, because their use cases, right, the ways in which they use image recognition technology is to sharpen images that come from the JWST, from the Hubble, from any number of Earth-based and orbiting observatories. And in so doing, they have some fantastic technologies that render these images in like startling detail. But these technologies could also be paired with algorithmic text generation to generate incredibly accurate alt text. But this is only possible because the objects in question are being rendered over and over and over and over again using predictive algorithms, right? I would not trust it, say, to auto caption, a picture of my cat. Well, I might trust it to do that. Actually, I probably would. No. So like, I don't necessarily think that auto or algorithmically generated alt text is a bad thing. I just do not think we have the technology to do that. It's in the class of technologies that could be great if developed, e.g. automated captioning that could capture language, or that could capture non-English language in its or multiple languages in a single space, but the technology really isn't there yet. And indeed, the only reason I think we should ever develop such actually, as an aside, I think we should spend less time trying to make that technology very good and more time paying actual cart folks and transcriptioners, because a machine will be incapable of picking up on nuance, of say, dealing with vocal fry or other kinds of just generally human activities in speech in the same way that a human captioner can, because the machine, again, is a stochastic parrot. It does not understand what is being said. It only parrots back what's in its database. So, which is why it shocked the hell out of me when when PowerPoint's captioning caught y'all as like Y''ALL. Somebody must have done something with that data set. But so it's a wonderful dream, and I think that would be an incredible use of generative algorithms. I just don't think we're anywhere near the technology to do that yet. And it would fix a lot of problems in that I would indicate in the latter bit of my talk, particularly with misfitting in digital environments, right? For blind folks or for folks with difficulty seeing, if social media platforms built in automated alt text for every image posted, it would resolve a lot of issues with the adoption of alt text in specific technologies.
Thank you. I just want to give folks one more minute. If they're typing a question right now, can you just post into the Q&A box typing, just so we can see if someone is like working their way through a question. And while someone I think just wrote, let's see. Did someone write typing or did it just pop up? You saw it, Sarah? Okay,
Yeah.
great. Oh, go for it. Thank you.
For sure. So there's another question from David who asks, you spoke about assistive technology rebranding as AI to obfuscate functions, specifically with hearing aids. Is there another example of a piece of assistive tech using this trend?
Sure. Yeah, there are a number of ways that assistive technology is like pivots to AI. So, for example, typically any piece of assistive technology that previously used say machine learning or algorithmic technologies that subsequently calls itself say AI powered, has done this kinds of shift. Now, beyond hearing aids, and I tend to point to hearing aids as an example because it's fairly widespread. There are other applications like so I'm sure many of us are aware of the ill-fated attempts to translate sign language gloves into or ill-fated attempt to create gloves that translated sign language into into spoken like language. There are other similar applications that seek to use visual interfaces to do the same thing, which I have deep problems with because there are ASL interpreters who exist. But for the most part, it is hard to point to more specific examples of assistive technologies rebranding as AI to obfuscate function because of the ways in which the rebranding takes place and how quickly it takes place. That said, this is one of those things that I'd like to do a further deep dive into. I was in this talk focused more specifically on hearing aids because it is the one area of assistive technology that has made a lot of noise about its pivot to being AI powered, so to speak. I think there are some pacemakers or insulin pumps that have made similar shifts.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Flowers, for your presentation. We haven't gotten any more questions. Yemi just thanked you for your great presentation. And I want to thank you also for speaking with us today. Thank you everyone who attended. Thank you to our captioner, Sarah, and also my research assistant, Sarah. I want to point your attention to, we have 2 events next week. Dr. Mara Hicks will be speaking about computing history, and Dr. Murphy will be speaking about birdsong and place thought in the aftermath. So please join us for those events as well. And we look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.